Okay, comrades, let me proceed. So I'm going to present the section on the Communist Manifesto and its relevance today. And as I've said, this is amongst 2025 is actually 177th anniversary of the publication of the document known as the Communist Manifesto. Not to be confused with electoral manifesto. I'm a manifesto where my elections. This is a manifesto that is a political statement that is calling for action. Published 1848. And in this paper that I'm going to present, because it's also in the paper form, I hope comrades can share that also on their WhatsApp group. We will reflect on this 177 years since the publication of the Communist Manifesto and explore whether that manifesto of so many years is still relevant today, and trace the influence of this document. Very short, it looks like a pamphlet. Very short document. The influence it had on revolutionary movements. And also look at its critique of what we end up calling reformist social democracy. Reformist social democracy. And examine the rise and the setbacks of socialist countries and also look at the resurgence of imperialism in the era we call globalization or neoliberal globalization. So basically this paper is trying to reflect on the principles of Marxism-Leninism, how they continue to inform the struggles for socialism, particularly through the work of the South African Communist Party in the South African context, and argue that the manifesto remains a critical guide for working class movement seeking systematic transformation. Okay. So that is almost the sum. Okay, let me just, thank you so much.
Is it charging? Yeah, it is.
All right. So let me get to the background and the context, Matawa. The first thing that I need to do is to talk about Guti, what was happening in 1848? Why this document emerged during that particular time? Well, the manifesto, historical context is defined by the collapse of feudalism. There was a collapse of feudal societies there in Europe in particular, and the rise of the bourgeoisie and the emergence of what we call the industrial working class. So that was the context of the 1840s. This industrial working class, the proletariat, So, at that time, capitalist relations of production were expanding globally, not just in Europe. They were beginning to expand globally. So the two, as they expand, so is the polarization, the division between classes, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. So the manifesto proclaimed, even their first sentences there, proclaimed that the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle. So, basically, the manifesto was saying we can only understand the world events, world history, from the point of view of class struggle. See, you know, in the world, a lot of people can interpret the world in many ways. But what the manifesto was asserting is that if you want to understand the world, the history of the world, not just the history of capitalism, the history of the world, of human society, human history, you have to understand it from a class perspective, from class-based terms, so to say. So, that the working class, it didn't just end up there, the manifesto, that we need to understand that, which it does in the first, opening remarks of opening statements of the manifesto. But that the working class, the proletariat, organized and conscious, hold key to the future of human society. The working class. It made no confusion about this. It didn't say bad, and so on. It says the working class hold the future. So at that time, and there were people who talked about socialism. That, there has to be a society where there are no class distinctions, where there is no rich and poor, and so on and so on. But a lot of these thoughts were more of utopian kind. You are poor, and you are not my illusions. You dream, you are romantic. They were not founded on science. They were founded on feelings, morality, your moralistic appeal. You are appealing to the ruling class. People like Robert Owen, I'm sure you have heard about this English capitalist who realized that the way he's treating the workers has to do with the way the system is structured. But his offer to the solution was that I must appeal to the ruling capitalist class to have a heart, to have a harmony with the workers, and then you will have peace and happiness. That's why they are called utopian socialists. There were ideas of socialism. Marx did not invent the word socialism or Engels. They were there, these socialist ideas. Their problem, they were not scientific. They were not scientific. So, Marxism offered, by Marxism we know, talking about those ideas that derive from his work, Marx, Engels, and those after him, many of us, including ourselves here. We are the contributors to the theory of Marxism. And provided a scientific analysis to why people are rich, why people are poor, why we have all these problems in the world. They provided that scientific analysis. So, and that analysis, we know it is grounded in this thing we call Marxist philosophy, historical materialism. The one that says you can only interpret history on a class basis. So what pushes history to go forward is because there will always be two classes in history. Whether it's the history of feudalism, history of slavery, history of capitalism, there will always be these two classes. When they struggle, when they enter into conflict, they drive history to go forward. Which is why historical materialism was the scientific way of understanding this. So identifying the role of what we call the productive forces, labor, machines, land, if we put them together, they produce these things that they produce this thing we call wealth. Things that make us to exist, to eat, to have a house, to protect yourself, have a decent house, to have a clothing. This labor and the tools of making wealth were called the productive forces. And that it's not only the productives, but how you relate in production, in producing this wealth. This wealth also matters. That was Karl Marx. That it's not just good to say I'm producing, but how you relate with others. Who owns the machine which you are going to produce your wealth? Who owns the tools? Matters in the same way as who provide labor to these tools. So the history of class struggle is also the history of the relations between the productive forces and the relations of production. This is what shapes history. This is what shapes history. So they laid a foundation. This analysis of putting everything is always in a mode of contradictions or conflicts of opposites. Laid the foundation for a revolutionary theory of Marxism. So I will let me put that into context. So I've said he presented communism and socialism, unlike utopian socialists, as a scientific thing. To apply scientific tools to understand a reality, historical reality. But the other important thing I want to mention is that Marxism had huge influence on countless political movements. Sometimes people think it only because it's a Communist Manifesto, it influenced only our communist parties. No, it has influenced beyond our communist movements, not just communist parties around the world. This is very, very important, and I will show that. And it changed, the manifesto changed the world course of history. If history was going this way, the influence of the Communist Manifesto changed it to another direction. and that it remains relevant to this day. So let me just speak quickly around the early influence. I talked about the red document was in the early 1840s, meaning the late 19th century and so on. And it became rapidly, within a short space of time, the Communist Manifesto, because it was not just a big document, maybe that also helped us, a pamphlet, but the way it was written and translated in many languages, not just Germany or English, and continuing to be translated today. I've come across a Zulu version of the Communist Manifesto, and I'm told that these days of AI, you can even turn it in any language, provided with, it doesn't distort the language and the tone and so on. So it has spread, but in its early period, it was a guiding light to our civilians. Because workers were seeking answers, and utopian solutions were not helping. Sometimes they found them defeated, they are unable to answer what is going on with our lives. And then someone has said, no, let's move for it now. Yes, I'm going to go. So, very, very confused working class. I asked what the hell is going on in the world? So, the manifesto in those years became a guiding light to many workers across the world. So, for instance, that very year, in 1848, there were uprisings of workers across Europe, France, Germany, Australia, Italy, and other regions. Workers just revolting against capitalist exploitation and capitalist domination. They were motivated by many demands. Some of the demands were really what today we can call them national democratic demands in our language of today. There were demands for transformation of society, and so on. And these revolts reflected a very deep discontent among the working class and the peasants, including the peasant. And remember, a Communist Manifesto does talk about other class forces other than just the bourgeoisie. It talks about stratas like our peasants. So these revolts, were eventually defeated. They were defeated easily. I think they lasted up to 1848. 1848, 1849. But they signal a turning point in European politics. Because never before our servants can just bapume the way they cope, the way they went out in this uprising. Never before. So there were very, very important early beginnings of what we can call a working class struggle. A working class struggle. Our servants, they were doing these things independently. They were not led by another group of class forces. They were doing them independently as workers. Very, very important. Which means the workers were proclaiming, Sifigile, we exist. We exist. So those were the early days. And the lessons from 1848, comrades, shaped Karl Marx, Engels' strategic thinking about the necessity of building our class alliances. One of the class alliances into a march. To do a dad. But by that time, when he was talking about class alliances, they were talking about our peasants. They were talking about this petty bourgeois. They want to swap our petty bourgeois. But they are not the petite bourgeois, aspirant bourgeois. Why aspire? He's not there, but one day he's a someone like that. Okay? So these classes, Marx and Karl Marx started to think about a theory strategically, as a strategy. Theory of our alliances. So yabona ukuthi even our thina masikhuluma manje ngabo national democratic revolution and blah blah blah. We draw inspiration from a long time with our comrades badala nabacabanga kanjani ngomzabalazo. But more important, they started to look at those lessons of 1848 for the need for political organization of the working class. Working class had no political parties there. If they had something, even when they were struggling and so on, maybe abantu bama society, forming society, clubs, associations, trade unions of those era. It was not really political organizations that were constituted in those periods. So they started to begin to think in those terms. And also they were starting to think about preparing ourselves to seize power, state power. The question of state power started to emerge. By what? By reading, because Marx was a historical material. He concretely analyzed what was happening on the ground and take those ideas to shape a theory yomzabalazo wabasebenzi. So that is where they understood that capitalism is not something eternal. It's not here to stay forever. It's not an eternal system that, sometimes our grandparents will always tell you about apartheid. But we told until. They were born under those conditions. Capitalism can create that mentality among ourselves. We born in jail, the system is powerful, man. And then you started to admit that I permanent. Which means it cannot be changed. It cannot be defeated. So, but when Karl Marx was analyzing the historical specificity, not generality, that capitalism is not a general system that is therefore, it's only specific in history. There were other systems before it. They are no longer there. Feudalism was 9,000 years old. Slavery, another few thousand old. Capitalism is not even yet 1,000 years old. It's not even history. It probably is 500 years old. At any time in a hamba. But as Marx says, it's a product of any class struggle. Feudalism was replaced by a class struggle that produced the capitalist. When you compare capitalism and feudalism, capitalism was progressive. from the history's point of view. So Marx in the manifesto does say, yes, Abungibankulu were progressive once upon a time, because they defeated feudalism. They played a progressive role in history. That's what he said. He praised them. Of showing Uti, they played a role, because compared with feudalism, from the capitalism was better compared with feudalism. Capitalism was better. The serfs and the worker and the proletariat, the proletariat was better than the serf. The serf was a class oppressed under feudalism. Master and servant under slavery. I mean, the slave and the slave owner. So, that was very, very important. So, he identified his historical progressive role in the manifesto, but he ended up not saying, the progressiveness will remain forever. He said they entered into a contradiction with a new class they have created, the class we know as the working class. So they created a contradiction. As soon as they create that contradiction now, they are no longer progressive now, they become reactionary. The bourgeoisie become reactionary. Paris Commune, 1871. Those are the early influences of the Communist Manifesto. So just few years, 25 years actually, after the Communist Manifesto, there emerged the Paris Commune. The first workers' government. And we always say Soviet Union is the first socialist workers' government. But in historical sense, there was a first workers' government, it is of the Paris Commune. But it lasted in jail for 72 days. But that 72 days was a day, if you see some of the writings like Karl Marx, like Civil War in France, he spent time and time again analyzing what are the workers doing. So he was doing a concrete analysis of a concrete situation. He didn't say, no, socialism should be like this, out of nowhere. So the Communist Manifesto, even in the Communist Manifesto, you will see Karl Marx does not provide a detail into what he is socialism in its full sense. Ungati RDP document. No. He analyzed, he adopted general principles that can guide socialism, but not a blueprint. Not a good socialism. Communist Manifesto, you will never find any detailed program of because he was scientific. That's why it's so difficult for people to say, Communist Manifesto said this, but it never happened. Or it was not true, or it was wrong. No, because it was written in such a way that it doesn't give you a blueprint. Because it's very scientific. Your solutions to the problems of the capitalism will derive from your own class struggles. That is why in Paris Commune, that 72 days, he spent time analyzing it. What are the workers doing? This is very, very important. And because la Paris Commune in France, the workers were responding to the defeat of France to a certain war that took place there called the French-Prussian War, Franco-Prussian War. And the people of France rose up. They expelled the bourgeoisie from the state apparatus. Also, from government. And the workers take over. Particularly in Paris. So Paris was under workers' control. They controlled the factories. They separated Isonto from the government. Those days of feudalism, Isonto, no government in into in one. I need to bafuna ukuthi ingene kakhulu. Unqondo yeni They introduce izinto zafana ukuthi education shall be free, public education. Though brutality, you know, so they did a lot of things. For instance, they introduced a democratic recall. One of the things that I've learned about the Paris Commune, Marx also talks about it. By introducing democratic recall, sayazi democratic recall. Ma we elect umuntu, if we are scandal, buya vote. Abasebenzi bayenza kanjani? They elected you, and then they can bring you back. But you know, we will wait for another 5 years and by elections. See the democratic recall. Then they reduce the wages. By reducing wages, then there was a wage gap. There's a wage gap. I get. But I call them. Here is an average wage for every worker versus maybe a manager or one bank. It was a workers' government. But though it lasted 72 days, comrades, and brutally so, it was brutally suppressed. Thousands upon thousands of communards were killed. I think the official number, I think the number that has been confirmed, 20,000 communards in Spain were massacred. Communards, over, the workers who took over. But the Commune confirmed Marx's analysis that a capitalism state should not be simply taken over. See, this is another thing that Karl Marx says. That Karl Marx, the state, don't just take it. You know, you are in charge, but you don't transform it. You are we change a flag, you know the flag. Let's have a flag, the rainbow flag. And then you leave the state run as it was. Settle. Yeah. So Marx learned a very important point there. He says the state must not be taken over. He used a very, very harsh way. He said it must be smashed. Smash the state. Hey, we want to smash the state. But literally transform the state. We tataranja, we fuck upside down. When you look at that state, you look at the old state, you can't differentiate, you can't fundamentally compare. They are the same. We turn upside down the state. So that it becomes the state that serves the workers. Not the Bungu. So by doing that, you are basically laying the basis of replacing capitalism with a new forms of democracy. working class democracy, people's democracy. So those are the lessons. But as umzabalazo wabasebenzi continued from those early years of the 1840s, as the struggle of the workers getting matured now, the workers are getting matured, so did our ideological currents, which is my next slides. Okay, maybe before I come here, before I come here. Yeah, I said, as did umzabalazo wabasebenzi ukhula, as it grows and getting matured, so does the ideological currents within that movement. And the space expands of worker struggles. So does within the socialist movements of those days. What develop our currents? Currents means different way of seeing things. Some comrades song, but too different. What was happening? A major turning point of this different ideological currents was the Second International. Karl Marx was not a writer, he was an activist. He actually formed the First International. Part of the formation was led by him, not necessarily him as an individual, but together with the working class leaders and activists of those particular days. But as Second International, I was split. But there were others, so I'm anarchists. Who didn't believe that you need state power. They also mind said state power, but state power. No state power. Let's just run our factories without state. We don't want state power. We don't want anyone to become, we don't even want workers to have their own government, basically. Without government. So there were those kinds of currents. Then, among them, was those parties, political parties that emerged, who supported their own ruling class. Anarchists, but who call themselves socialists in name, but in practice, I call. They supported the ruling classes of those countries. And this became very obvious during the First World War, 1914. First World War, where we saw a betrayal of some of these so-called socialist parties. Passaportaini, they are ruling classes in their own countries, like Europe. And that marked a deep ideological rupture with revolutionary Marxism. Because to accommodate, to work with the ruling class meant basically to become reformist. You no longer believe that this state must be replaced by a socialist state. You believe that mangangena lapha izinto zizachange. Shothi ungena kuwo la ubona ngathi zizachange. So it confirmed that the ideological currents that lasted for years, not now, they lasted even up to this day. We still find our currents exist where there are working class organizations. There are certain formations that you can call reformist organizations. Reformist, you want reforms that does not abolish capitalism. Ufuna ama reforms, they can give you a class education, but ufuna education is awunikeza, but siyeke nje, siyeke umnotho wethu. Lo mnotho wethu ngawuthashwa sizawunikeza education. Or ufuna minimum wage, sizawunikeza minimum wage, but don't touch property. Thina sekunqoba nkulu siyeke siphethe le property, which is the ownership of the wealth must remain in our hands as the capitalists. That's what we call reformism. Reformism. Mark the word easily, reforming. Kusho wena ubheke nje uchentshalala. Babathi change capital kuthi hayi complete kwancane le. But lezi ezinye ezincane lezo uyasifuna. But ukuthi abelungu the bourgeoisie to be replaced, you are not for it. Size one, ne? Yes. Revolutionary Marxism, we must abolish capitalism and eventually abolish classes in society. Communist Manifesto, it's clear about these things. That is why he spends his time exposing this reformism under the guise of his socialism in the manifesto itself. So, because these parties, if I can go further, they promoted collaboration and parliamentary gradualism. One of them was called Bernstein in Germany. Utamati is the father of social democracy. Yeah, he was saying, Masigene parliament, sifaka lomthetho, hayi socialism is a fee. So that, okay, so I now believe only through parliament we can take over. Marx disagreed. The Communist Manifesto disagreed. Because the idea was not to defeat capitalism, but to humanize the capitalism. Capitalism must appear humane, quote unquote, humane. Ngoba unikeze education kancane, unikeze maybe salary increase lapha, manje ujabulile. So it was that particular thing that claiming that socialism can be achieved through incremental and reformist reforms. Not revolutionary reforms, but through reformist reforms. So that's what we call bourgeois democracy. If you agree on it, that will mean in democracy will become a bourgeois democracy. It doesn't reduce their power, it increases their power. So, as 1914, as initial, it was the biggest year where this social democracy take the side of Unkulu, while Lenin, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, took his side like Karl Marx, the Communist Manifesto, and insisted that the bourgeoisie state must be smashed, to use his words now, and establish the dictatorship of the proletariat. Sometimes people think with dictators. What it meant is that workers' power. During those days, the word dictatorship was not the way we understand it today. We are not saying you must be Idi Amin or something like that. What it meant was that power must shift from the capitalist class to the class. So it is what today we also say, hey, get more. Working class, hey, get more. It's part of power. In all sides of power, the state, in the economy, in cultural institutions, and working class understood broadly, not those of us who told us salary. It includes even Alabama surveys, or they are doing something, they are part of the working class. So majority, basically it was about majority rule, working class dictatorship, not a minority ruling over the majority. That's another way to understand it. But from a class perspective, that's how. So Lenin talked about this dictatorship of the proletariat and the smashing of the bourgeoisie. While many of these socialist parties, some of them we can mention them by their names during those days. Britain, it was called Labour Party, it's still there. But the Labour Party is part of the social democrats. Europe, SPD, Germany, small democratic party. Okay. So they abandoned the revolutionary Marxism. They abandoned Hitler's struggle. About Hitler's struggle in their meeting, but hey, they abandoned class struggle. So, in favor of what? In favor of electoral gains. Positions were minister and what. That's all they were concerned about. As important legislature, General Secretariat. So those things are not important, dang it. But if we leave Aranjalo and you just want to reform capitalism, you are going nowhere. Settle. And the parliament is not only the sign of power, of a capitalist, of power wrestled by the capitalist class. Capitalist class has got power in many centers, the economy, the state. We must be felt in all sides of power. Not just, even we need to state power. That is why Zabala's way to always talk about people's power or workers' power with Amanda Abe Nabasebenz. You know, sometimes if I take theoretically what the GS was talking about, that give power to the people. That's what the Soviet Union, which is my next slide, did after the Paris Commune. After the Paris Commune. And that's what the answer. Yeah. This is what happened. 1914, it is split, but for the first time in the history of Zabalazo, abantu base-Russia brought down Abu Dhabi for many lasting decades. More than, I think, about 70 years, so from 72 days to 70 years. Workers, the first, that's why it's called the first world workers' government, lasting world, first world workers' government. Indeed, led by Bolsheviks, Communist Party of Soviet Union, as we call it, the Bolsheviks. And it took place during World War I, First World War. So immediately after 1914, 1915, when the capitalism was in a serious crisis all over the world, Soviet Union emerged as the first working class state. But Abu Ngabankuli didn't even waste time. Why? Because the message from that revolution was shaken, shook the bourgeoisie all over the world, including here in South Africa. Yes, there was no internet, there was no Google or Ganjani, but the message yafika fast. Nama telegram or what, hey, abasebenzi baphethe eRussia. So workers in Europe joined now. They joined the struggle, wanted to overthrow their governments as well. So the socialist revolution, which today we still mark and celebrate as Amakomanis, is a significant event in the history of our struggle for socialism. It was a significant event. First and foremost, it proved Marxism right. Because capitalism is not here forever. That is viable. It is possible with workers. Who has ever thought that workers can run a government? Basically, you can have a factory without the bosses. Can you imagine servants who run a mine and our bosses? Those mines are in your hands. Yeah, but that's what happened in Russia. The Soviets came into power. They came into power. And they produced a society that is far superior than capitalism. Kusho ukuthi moyibona le society, no, angisabukele emuva capitalism. Ngiyaphambi. Ngoba it is a liberating experience. It was a liberating experience. The workers can abolish what Karl Marx called class exploitation. Class exploitation. So, beyond the Soviet Union, the influence of the Communist Manifesto went beyond the Soviet Union. We saw the rise of what is called the socialist camp. The world socialist camp. So USSR was our base through which, without Soviet Union, I don't think that movement would have been as grown as it was. It's true. Because it didn't just provide it, no, we are superior. It didn't just show an example. It provided our resources and support for the movement all over the world. For the workers, the oppressed. China, Cuba, Vietnam, Eastern Europe joined. Especially after the Second World War. And then in the South, like Africa, Asia, and Latin America, there emerged even what is called the non-alignment movement. Yeah, well, you know, confused non-alignment to me, which they don't know where they stand. Non-alignment meant which they want to free themselves from imperialism, the colonialism, but at the same time become autonomous, pursue their own development based on the concrete conditions of their own countries. You know, this issue of non-alignment is emerging already in Amanje. There was a time where it went down, especially after the collapse of Soviet Union. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. And then we now see its re-emergence. The non-alignment movement. You can think about BRICS as some of the elements of that non-alignment movement. You don't have to be a socialist government, but you may have progressive ideas as a government to align with such a movement. I hope we understand each other. Okay. But not only would manifesto is just the existence of government, but what did it do? What do they do with it? Look at the statistics. These are all statistics because they reflect that period of the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s, up to maybe the socialist achievements. Everything that was produced in Phadu, the share, those countries were backward before. Russia was like a semi-feudal. It was not fully capitalism like America or Britain. China, Cuba, and so on, and Eastern Europe, they were very low. But because of the socialist revolution, their production just shot up. They became global players when it comes to production, thanks to socialism. To read and write, improved, sometimes literacy free. There are societies in social society where everybody has to read, has to write, and so on. Compared to capitalist societies. Health and equality in many things was literally, the way of life. And in the paper, we do mention people who were inspired by the socialist revolution, and also inspired by the ideas contained in the manifesto. I will even advise comrades to read O.R. Tambo. There are others, Ho Chi Minh, Mao, no Fidel, no Castro. But listen to O.R. Tambo, who officially we know, when it was unveiled in Tambo, but Tambo was a non-communist. But when he talks about the Soviet Union, you have no doubt which side is he taking on? Or and if you look at much of his writings, O.R. Tambo, and I really support what GS is also saying, that's funny the O.R. Tambo. There's this book called O.R. Tambo Speak, Oliver Tambo Speaks. You must look at what he says about class exploitation. South Africa will never be free until we resolve the class question. Exploitation of, yes, in those days, man by man, but literally peasant by peasant. Speaking as the president of the, but recognizing the Freedom Charter and everything is not possible under conditions of capitalism. Can only be realized under conditions of socialism. But socialism will guarantee that Freedom Charter, they remain there forever. Not under capitalism. Under capitalism, was a full extent, but it's because here pounds included. Because here peso. That is under capitalism. Yes, because nobody control everything. I wouldn't know about control everything. Mama works as a day. I'm a salary. Utola jabuli. Hey, Tonina increase. Mama works as about no inflation in peso. So things are not guaranteed. When there is an economic growth, they are smiling, they are happy, they can even give you money that you didn't. But when things are tough, not in a socialist society. Have you ever heard but only under conditions of capitalism. Is it possible? So is it that you have won in 1994? It's true they can be reversed. It's true they can be eroded. It's true that what you have gained today can be lost tomorrow, including political power. Political power can be reversed under conditions of capitalism. So, as in Gauteng, very, very nice. The Soviet Union. It had not been the Soviet Union. No Zabala's way to Lona will never have been where it is. We owe too much to the struggle and the sacrifice of the people of Soviet Union, socialist countries in particular, and the world socialist movement in general. Okay, comments. Then, the capitalism did not sleep. When he hear that socialist movement is growing, national liberation movements are developing in Africa, Asia, and Japan. But we must mount a counter-revolutionary offensive against what they call communism, containing communism global. And they did. We know our concept of Cold War. See, that is what the Cold War. Who a Cold War? You wonder, but they are using covert operations. Covert operations like CIA, killing our comrades in Chile, killing our comrades in DRC, Congo, Patrice Lumumba, assassinating political leaders, conducting coups, in order to contain in it the spread of our socialist ideas, and therefore of the Communist Manifesto, the spirit of the Communist Manifesto. Sayazi, they countered through IMF structural adjustment programs. We call it GEAR in South Africa. It was a self-imposed. The IMF did not impose, we imposed it ourselves, on ourselves, So GEAR, structural adjustment programs in Zimbabwe, where it privatized everything, it cut public services, and so on and so on. That was a counter-offensive. Let us see this in neoliberalism. Started in the 70s as a counter towards the spread of progressive and radical ideas. 1990, post-94, when we took power, umhlaba so changing. Many thought after the collapse of Soviet Union in particular, the rise of capitalism in a form of so-called globalization. But in society, hey, you to a ANC meeting, globalization, comrades. You find in the Communist Manifesto is nothing but what Karl Marx identified. Good capitalism, in order to make money, to make sure that our profits are pansy, it always globalizes. And Ullemin characterizes correctly that globalization is nothing other than imperialism. Imperialism. socialist. So, singazi ngama-English, you are confused about. Imperialism, and in the age of the post-90s, we call it neoliberal globalization. But in clear, it's a capitalism at its highest stage. Capitalism at its highest stage. It's so reached a stage where manje, it doesn't even destroy human lives, it destroys the planet. If it continues to exist in capitalism. I'm a scientist, but climate change. But if it's a temperature, there's this there will be floods, there will be drowning. In capitalism, because your life is not interested with how's your health? Is nature okay? No, what is okay for you? Am I getting money when I destroy the environment? Am I getting money when I don't give you a proper health, work safety? It's not your health that is interested in if you say there's mining. It is the money, your labor that is interested in. Profit before people and before nature. Let's not forget that. It's profit before people, but also before nature. So the result is that capitalism is in crisis almost every time today. Tinamako necessity is a multiple crisis. Inequality crisis. Climate change. The debt, scholar to say South Africa is too much. No, as with the about the debt in South Africa, such that the budgets of many African countries now are funded by Europe and the USAID. Like is about the USAID. The budget of many African countries. It's all about the budget, 40% comes from the revenue of that society. The rest we are not part. The budgets are. So those are the issues of a crisis. Now, let's now go back. This is my few two slides in Cadre about the manifesto in South Africa. I've already explained that Tina, we were inspired when we formed the Communist Party of South Africa, CPSA, in 1921. We were inspired by the Great October Socialist Revolution. I don't know what we would have looked like if there was no communist that revolution. Would there have been a communist party? Because that revolution inspired our comrades to come together. There were many socialist organizations, but they don't know totally direction, but no. As a formerly communist party, see join the communists in other countries. Now, in Communist Manifesto today, how the communists treat it, not only in South Africa, but all over the world. In each country, communists develop their, what they call a program. Every 5 years or every Congress, we adopt in it. A program is nothing but the South African Manifesto, Communist Manifesto. But the structure in which you analyze South Africa is based on Marxism-Leninism. You recognize historical materialism. You recognize the class struggle. You recognize the political economy of the capitalism and the struggle for socialism. So a framework of a program is like that. Just like how Marx analyzed it in the document of 1848, written by. Yes, I always say Marx, but why are you saying Engels? Well, Even Engels admitted that the Communist Manifesto, even though it is in his name, he said everything written there is exclusively Marx. Now, how many programs, Communist Manifestos of the South African Communist Party has ever produced? I think there was one in 1921. The one I don't see much, but comrades, it's in a rich library online to look at all our resources. Internet is there, check it for it. 1921, when we launched the Communist Party, SACP produced a Communist Manifesto yethu. Analyze our concrete conditions of South African capitalism and the struggle of the working class. And then, in 1928, saba a program that we call the Black Republican Festival. Yeah. Sometimes I remember when we do that, comrades don't explain why black. Well, well, at that time, the emphasis of blackness was to emphasize Gucci. Umzabalazo was South Africa must be led by the indigenous people, because originally the party was largely white. But over time, through communist discussion, we started to appreciate race and class. And by 1928, the party membership may change and a corner. Udaki umsebenzi ajoina the Communist Party. But the principle of that program was that there must be black majority rule. People don't know Guti, or democratic majority rule. People don't know Guti, of all political parties, including ANC those days, we were the first to demand democratic majority. ANC of those days, they know, sneakers of land, loan and peace, reformist. They were not interested in abolishing the apartheid state. Let them know to tag young apartheid, but whenever you find them here, they will exist as a day. But for them, the system was permanent. All they can do is to ask here and here. So Amakoman is better. That's why the Black Republican thesis must be understood in that context. But the second thing about that thing, it recognizes non-racialism. That while, because it is a class organization, we are a class, so it doesn't say white, do we support white or a black working class? Is it class liberation? Is a class of all classes irrespective of their card? So it makes sense to make non-racialism the core of the party's program. Again, who was the first to promote non-racialism in South Africa? The Communist Party. So the basic fundamental goals of our revolution, what we call National Democratic Revolution, were laid by a Marxist-Leninist party because it used Marxist scientific analysis. I think you know, I'm not science now. I'm a physics, the end. So in Marxist, you must always understand things. You must think about race, gender, from a class perspective. I show you are black, you are right. There is a class aspect of your card. Gender, the same. There is a white women working class, and there's a women bourgeois class. So you must understand these race things and other identities that are used, like including nationality, nations, and so on, from a class perspective.